It's a pleasure to introduce Tirza Latimer, who is an associate professor and chair of the graduate program in visual and critical studies at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco. She's published a lot of work from a lesbian feminist perspective on a range of topics and culture, and she's co-editor with Whitney Chadwick of the anthology The Modern Woman Revisited, Paris Between the Wars, and the author of Women Together, Women Apart, Portraits of Lesbian Paris. She's also about to assume a role similar to my own in that she is associate guest curator with Wanda Korn of an exhibition which will be coming here called Seeing Gertrude Stein, 5 Stories, opening at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco in April of 2011 and arriving here in October of this year. A companion book will also be released by the University of California Press. Tirza.
Okay. Well, first of all, hats off to Jonathan David Katz, David Ward, the National Portrait Gallery, and all of you. Now, let me see if I can find my, how do you do this? Okay. Well, here I am. Okay. I used up my 5 minutes of grace, so I get right down to it. Faith Ringgold's 1991 quilt painting, Dinner at Gertrude Stein's, was one of 12 paintings on quilted fabric in the French collection series, and it takes as given the canonical status of Gertrude Stein and the paintings in her collection, always referenced in traditional narratives of modernism. Tradition, the feminist art historian Griselda Pollock observes, is the canon's natural face. And in this form, cultural regulation participates in the way that its regime is lived by its populations as simply common sense. Tradition, Pollock concludes, is, to quote her again, not merely what the past leaves us, it must always be understood as selective, close quote. Art historians, critics, dealers, collectors, curators, art administrators, and archivists are tradition makers. They actively select which events to represent as culturally significant, and in this way may either ratify or challenge prevailing social values. Artists, too, actively participate in the selective historical process. Faith Ringgold, for instance, uses her creative license to locate influential African Americans of different generations, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, and Langston Hughes in Stein and Toklas's famous Salon. Ringgold's imaginative group portrait also incorporates Leo Stein, Gertrude's brother and fellow arbiter of modernism, Pablo Picasso, Gertrude's avant-garde discovery, and Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude's most famous literary protege. Thanks to Ringgold, these characters are able to share the same temporal and spatial frame. By playing freely with both biography and chronology, the artist tweaks one of modernism's originary scenes. Like much of Ringgold's work, this tableau reconciles deconstructive critical inquiry with feminist and race-conscious historical revisionism. But it is also significant, surely, although not mentioned in the literature Ringgold's piece has generated, that at least 4 of the cultural heavyweights pictured here are queer. In addition to Stein and Toklas, 2 of the African American cultural dignitaries Ringgold has invited to Stein's table, James Baldwin, here on the left, and Langston Hughes on the right, were not only gay, but the authors of pioneering literary works exploring, albeit with varying degrees of openness, the social dynamics of same-sex desire. Hughes, although deeply closeted, enjoyed close artistic and affective alliances with leaders of the new Negro movement in America, including Alain Locke, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, Richard Bruce Nugent, and Wallace Thurman. Homosexual desire as well as anti-racist activism strengthened the bonds shared by these men, although histories of their era rarely acknowledge homosexuality as a cultural matrix of the so-called Harlem Renaissance. Despite the emancipatory rhetoric animating African-American cultural life during the 1920s and 30s, Baldwin, born in 1924 at the apex of the new Negro movement, was driven by sexual as well as racial oppression into exile. Baldwin expatriated to France as a young adult in 1948, too late to meet Gertrude Stein, who died in 1946. As for Hughes, although Stein's close friend Carl Van Vechten, lover of black men and leading white advocate of Harlem culture, recommended his publications to Stein, she never invited Hughes to visit her when he was in Paris. Ringgold reconstitutes Stein's Salon Society to rectify this lapse. The names of the modernists who actually did attend the Saturday evening gatherings Stein hosted before the First World War are undoubtedly familiar to you. Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, Henri Matisse, Marie Laurencin, Guillaume Apollinaire, and others came to see her personal museum of modern art and to seek her patronage. Several of these figures are represented in the painting collection that Ringgold has replicated in Dinner at Gertrude Stein's. When I asked Ringgold about her decision to use Stein's salon as her locus of modernism, she responded that the answer, and by inference my question, was a no-brainer. She chose Stein's salon as the setting for this painting because it is legendary as the seat of Paris modernism. Enveloped in her priestly robes, with a manuscript on her lap, Gertrude Stein presides over Ringgold's imaginary assembly from an armchair of throne-like proportions. Picasso's iconic portrait of Stein hangs life-sized in direct alignment on the wall behind her, amidst works by other important artists Stein patronized. In the quilt painting, this portrait stands in complex relation to the African-American modernists Ringgold has added to the scene. Because of the 1906 portrait's prominence in the literature about Stein, in the literature about Picasso, and in the collections of the prestigious Metropolitan Museum of Art, Ringgold could safely assume that most viewers would recognize this image with its primitivist premonitions as a harbinger of high modernism. The presence in Ringgold's scenario of Hurston, Baldwin, Wright, and Hughes, as well as Ringgold's own surrogate standing in that white dress with puffy sleeves on the left, the story quilt's narrator, William Marie, positions African Americans, some of them women, as cultural producers, participants in modernism's conversations, rather than merely sources of creative inspiration. The centrally located and outscaled Picasso portrait at the same time reaffirms Stein's dominant position within the visual and literary arts of this period, while alluding to the author's famed friendship with Picasso. We see Picasso seated to Stein's left in Ringgold's painting, buttressing her along with Toklas, who sits on Stein's right. Ringgold's artistic choices, the colorful swatches of fabric she incorporates into the quilt's frame, the inclusion of a first-person narrative in the form of letters back home from William Marie, the iconic legibility of the painted figures, the homey ambiance of the scene, argue that culture evolves in domestic settings, at the dinner table, the sewing circle, the salon, and yes, even in bed, before appearing in galleries, museums, or libraries. Here, the artist brings together a visual genre, the quilt, associated with both women's work and African-American material culture, and modes of historical transmission, storytelling, letter writing, conversation, gossip, that transpire outside of official or institutional channels. These non-canonical visual and verbal forms combine to create Ringgold's story quilts, paintings that serially narrate an alternative history of modern culture, intentionally locating African Americans and women at the generative epicenter. Without the same deliberation, Ringgold's painting also affirms the prominence of queers on modernism's productive scene. This dimension is less legible, though, than that of gender or race for a number of reasons. In the absence of formal compositional or iconographic cues, the perception of sexual subjectivity requires biographical knowledge, whereas race and gender are usually more apparent. Biographical information about non-normative sexual subjects, moreover, may be difficult to obtain, protectively dissimulated by the queer subject and or censored posthumously by families, educational and cultural institutions, biographers, historians, publishers. The homosexuality of Langston Hughes, for instance, is no longer a closely guarded secret. But with respect to gay artists like Hughes and Baldwin, who militated in their ways against racism, the significance of queerness in shaping their creative profiles has been eclipsed by the significance of their African Americanness. Certainly, it is the latter that matters most to Ringgold. Then, too, gayness is not yet universally viewed as an artistic credential, and Ringgold's painting has a celebratory as well as critical ambition. As for Stein and Toklas, even though their lesbianism is even more widely acknowledged than the homosexuality of Baldwin and Hughes, it is generally presented as a private matter, and the cultural implications of their queer marriage underrated. Ringgold's tableau does little to remedy the domestication of what was, for Stein and Toklas, a radical sexual solution to the predicament of normative femininity. Stein's alignment with the portrait by Picasso and her physical closeness to the artist himself in this painting draws attention away from the primary relationship she shared with Toklas. Instead, Ringgold foregrounds Stein's bond with the painter of her famous portrait. I will not argue that Ringgold's reiteration of one of modernism's underlying storylines, Stein's friendship with Picasso, is without justification. Stein's association with Picasso during the Salon years formed the basis of her reputation as a collector, salonière, and author, and also established the terms of all her subsequent artistic relationships. Ringgold has acknowledged Picasso's patriarchal position in the genealogy of Paris's avant-garde and the extent to which he contributed to the crafting of Stein's canonical image by placing the 1906 portrait of Gertrude Stein along the central axis of her own composition. Toklas's placement, a respectable distance off to Stein's side, in addition to the characteristic primness of Toklas's posture, make her appear more like an accessory than a significant collaborator in the artistic revolution taking place under her roof. In contrast, Ringgold makes Stein's complicity with Picasso, who comfortably leans into the author's space, very evident. Paradoxically, Picasso himself did not minimalize the significance of Stein's sexuality or underestimate the generative force of the couple she formed with Toklas, as the tributes he created during this fertile period attest. Without a doubt, the most intimate of these was a small panel painting Picasso offered Stein in 1909. It pictures 6 rose-colored angels, all female, bearing gifts and trumpeting a celestial fanfare. They proffer a scroll inscribed with the words "Hommage à Gertrude." Stein promptly affixed the painting to the ceiling over the bed that she shared with Toklas, and there it remained for the 20-some-odd years that the couple continued to occupy the Rue de Fleurus apartment. By conjuring up a bevy of bare-breasted angels explicitly for Stein, Picasso implicitly acknowledges her libidinal orientation. This private painting, with its playful suggestion of eroticism, grapples with a problematic broached repeatedly by Picasso, Stein's gender discrepancy. Picasso's Cubist still life, The Architect's Table of 1912, should be read with this in mind. The painting exhibits all the hallmarks of the analytical Cubist approach that Picasso refined during these years, and often appears as an example in survey books and courses about modernism. Among the mostly manly objects assembled on this table, a pipe, a wine glass, a bottle of eau de vie de Marque, an architect's T-square, Picasso incorporates a calling card from Miss Stein, spelled M-I-S. The misspelling of Miss is usually viewed as evidence of Picasso's limited command of English. It is tempting, though, to speculate about the intentionality of the mistake. Nothing in Picasso's painting squares, as the broken profile of the T-square and the shattering of the painterly grid make clear. The same can be reasonably said of the gender codes Picasso puts into play. The handle Miss, in relation to Stein, whose name, moreover, exceeds the confines of the socially conventional calling card represented here, is in itself a mistake of sorts, not appropriate for an hommesse, a mannish woman, as Stein was sometimes called. One of Stein's calling cards shows up again in a Cubist collage, dice, packet of cigarettes, and calling card made by Picasso in 1914. This time, however, the card, a real carte de visite, bears 2 correctly spelled names, Miss Stein and Miss Toklas. The card is remarkable in that it formalizes the Stein-Toklas union in a public way only a few years after Toklas moved into the Rue de Fleurus and in the year that Leo Stein moved out. The piece incorporates, Picasso's piece incorporates the label from a cigarette pack, Toklas's brand, inscribed with the words referencing a sales tax, contribution indirecte. In relation to the calling card, token of friendship and exchange, the phrase indirect contributions seems to acknowledge the indirect influence Stein and Toklas exerted on Picasso's creative process. That Picasso would have saved the detritus of Stein and Toklas's visit and constructed out of this material what amounts to a double portrait suggests not only his closeness to Stein and Toklas during these years, but also his awareness of their relationship's cultural importance. Picasso's very first tribute to Stein, this now famous 1906 portrait, grappled even more visibly with the problematic of gender. How was Picasso to represent Stein? a potentially important patron, an unusually powerful woman, and one he could not dominate sexually or intellectually. Comparing the portrait of Gertrude Stein with two examples produced by the previous century's most influential portraitist, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, illuminates one of Picasso's solutions. The Ingres portrait embroiders on established conventions of feminine portraiture to create a refined and highly decorative overall effect. You do not see these feminine attributes, the sensual surfaces, deferential body language, exposed skin, and gracious facial symmetry in the portrait of Stein. To portray Stein, Picasso adopted and adapted conventions of masculine portraiture instead, as per this well-known Ingres portrait of Louis-François Bertin. Taking his cues from the masculine body language of Stein's own self-performance, Picasso records Stein's direct regard, serious expression, solid bearing, and sober clothing. He provides her with a neutral setting that does not compete with the figure. He places emphasis on her head, intellect, rather than her body. The mask-like face Picasso made for Stein conveys her impenetrability as well as her profound unfeminine otherness. She cannot be possessed or known by the painter in the usual way he possesses or knows women subjects. This portrait, which migrated more and more favorably in relation to the other paintings on Stein's walls as Picasso's stock climbed, was adopted by Stein as a kind of logo. Photographs document the painting hanging prominently in various domiciles. The Rue de Fleurus Atelier, this is a Man Ray photograph from 1922. The Rue Christine apartment, Cecil Beaton took this one in 1938. The country retreat in southeastern France, photographed here by Thérèse Bonny in 1941. During the Second World War, which Stein and Toklas spent in Vichy territory, the only two paintings they retrieved from the Paris apartment were Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein and Cézanne's Woman with a Fan. They sold the Cézanne for food, but returned Picasso's portrait to its place in their Paris apartment after the liberation. Although Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein was never exhibited outside of Stein's homes during her lifetime, it had, thanks to the reproduction of photographs such as these in various journalistic, literary, and artistic publications, a public life of its own as Stein's trademark. Picasso's portrait functioned so well as an emblem for Stein because it visually entwined non-normative gender expression with vanguard artistic expression. Although Stein's friendship with the likes of James Baldwin and Langston Hughes is a compensatory fiction created by Faith Ringgold, many young gay artists did make their way to Stein's door between the two world wars, and they knew of her by the images she projected as much as by her writings. The composers Virgil Thompson, Aaron Copland, Paul Bowles, and Gerald Berners, choreographer Frederick Ashton, photographers Cecil Beaton and George Platt-Lynes, painters and interdisciplinary artists Jean Cocteau, Pavel Chelychev, Christian Stony, Christian Bérard, Eugene Berman, and Francis Rose, authors Carl Van Vechten, Bravig Eames, Charles Henry Ford, and Samuel Stewart were drawn to Stein because she visibly represented sexual as well as artistic freedom. Picasso maintained his distance from Stein after the First World War and dismissed her new protégés as second-rate talents, simultaneously denigrating her artistic judgment and the work produced by her new followers. Picasso sneered, "If you want to see how much she really knows about painting, all you have to do is look at the crap she likes now." Whether this statement was prompted by jealousy or homophobia, Picasso's outburst speaks of a widening rift between the two friends at a time when Stein's head was turned by the admiration of a new coterie, to whom she referred as her second family. If Picasso's macho posturing and the soaring prices his work commanded on the international art market after the First World War had reversed the power relations pictured by Ringgold, where Stein's dominance and Picasso's tolerance of it is obvious, within Stein's interwar gay male milieu, she maintained a position of strength and influence. Stein's collaborations with this new generation of admirers, moreover, ensconced her in a queer artistic vanguard that generated variant trends within modernism. One of these, neo-romanticism, claimed sentiment as an organizing principle in opposition to the formalism of high modernism and intellectualism of neoclassicism, as well as what Virgil Thomson described as the Picasso marketers. This untold backstory points to important aspects of modernism's history implicit in Ringgold's quilt painting, where queer subjects, although not explicitly named as such, body forth suppressed dimensions of our cultural history. If, as historians, we were to take discrepant sexuality seriously as an analytical focus, we would have to ask why so many of the figures represented in Ringgold's revisionist tableau are queer. Another no-brainer, because they were there, at the center of things, shaping the artistic life of 20th century Europe and America. We would then have to ask, what can attending to queerness tell us about modernism, its variants, and its legacies? The papers presented here today and the exhibition that created this forum within our National Museum address these questions for the first time in such a symbolically charged environment. If the controversy surrounding this exhibition's queer focus suggests that it is still politically expedient to stigmatize sexual variance, the scholarship and artworks assembled here at the National Portrait Gallery demonstrate our nation's profound cultural debt to queerness. Thank you. Oh, and thank you, Jonathan, for touting the Gertrude Stein exhibition, and I hope that you'll all come back to the National Portrait Gallery next October 14th, precisely, for the opening of Seeing Gertrude Stein, 5 Stories.